Hello nippies, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, hi, hello, I'm Nips, a freelance artist, and today we are going to be trying out the HUION Kamvas Pro 13 2.5K pen display. And yes, I ended up replacing my old Wacom with it, so now it's just another screen. This video isn't sponsored, but they did send me the tablet to try out, so that's what we're gonna do in the form of a tutorial. A lot of you have asked me to do a breakdown on how I render my drawings, so I'll be showcasing some of my personal favorite methods in case you want to try them out yourself. But first, let's go over the specs and what comes in the box. It's a 13-inch pen display with 2.5K resolution, which is the first of its kind in this size. The screen is anti-glare glass, which is wear resistant, so you don't need an additional protector. And it has a nice mat that makes it feel more like pencil on paper, which topped off with the felt nibs for the seamless traditional art experience. It's got 16.7 million display colors, so you can see your pieces more vibrantly. The screen is fully laminated, which means there's no air gap between the glass and the LCD panel, so your cursor will always follow the pen nib tightly and eliminate the parallax. And probably my favorite of the features is the USB-C to USB-C single wire connection that includes the power, display, and USB all in one. No more messy setups. It's also got 7 programmable keys that I didn't really use for art since I already have a tour box and a stream deck, so instead I programmed them for music and window management. In the box, we have the tablet, a foldable stand, an artist glove, cleaning cloth, and quick start guide, a donut pen holder with spare nibs, the pen, and a box of cables containing the USB-C to USB-C, 3 and 2, USB power cable, and an extender. They also sent me this really nice laptop holder, which just looks super sleek. So let's finally set it all up and get started. Today I'll be using an old drawing of my webcomic character Yotaro from a lighting study I sadly never finished, and maybe I'll work on it again, I don't know. And because it's so old, I've decided to just re-sketch it because it also serves as a nice excuse to test the pen sensitivity for line art. And now that I think about it, with all that effort, I probably could have just drawn something new. I wanted to keep these sketches simple since I'll be explaining the principles of my rendering styles rather than focusing on making an elaborate drawing. So excuse the blandness. Hopefully this brief overview will be helpful and at the very least a little bit interesting. My digital styles vary between line art, no line art, one layer, 500, textured brushes, or smooth, or a combination of everything. So for this video, I'll be covering the ones with semi-polished line art since I think that's what's most representative of my work. Though I've been drawing without line art a lot recently, so I'll have to make another video in the future. And since line art isn't really part of the rendering process, we'll add it to that list for future nips to worry about. However, it was part of my tablet testing, and I will say I was incredibly impressed. They were not lying about how responsive the pen pressure is. Since line art is one of my favorite parts of the art process, this is probably the main decider for me when I'm looking for a tablet, and it was able to just easily transition from incredibly thick to thin in one stroke, and also it kept up with my quick lines for the dynamic feel, good width, and taper. And this is ultimately what made me replace my Wacom with this, so let's hope it's good in the long run. So now that I have my lines, let's start off with the first style. Gradient flats. This is the simplest of the three, and I use it mostly when I want to make a sketch look finished without too much effort. Sometimes the flats alone can look nice, but adding subtle gradients can go a long way in adding dimension. The biggest thing for me in this style is the use of a round brush with some spacing instead of the classic soft airbrush, because I absolutely love the character it adds to the drawing, and all I had to do was change the brush. Even though I call this gradient flats, I do add a bit of highlights and shadows because, well, I can't help myself. Might as well keep going. And that's probably what makes this part the hardest for me, because, like, when do I stop? The rule I try to keep is shading mouth corners, lips, nose, cheeks, ears, under the neck, and significant depth indicators. I know that last one was a mouthful, but it's basically areas where a contrast in depth is obvious and large enough to be worth shading. So there weren't many in this drawing, so I did the far side of his face a little bit. Highlights are usually along the same locations as the shadows for a bit of contrast, and sometimes I like to add a little rim lighting as well, because when has it not made anything look better? Lastly, line art color. Same principle as flats versus gradients, just more dimension. And since there's not much going on in my drawings in this style, I try to use some fun saturated colors in the whole drawing in general. And though I am noticing I didn't really do much of that here, so, great tutorial, do as I say, not as I do. Here is a correction of this drawing post-filming. Next is soft cell shade. This is probably the style I've used the longest, and thus it's also the one that's changed the most. So I'll be talking about my current process. And like the gradient flats nowadays, I use the space round brush to lay down my shadows rather than a solid one. I have never been a big fan of hard shadows, so I lean towards a softer approach. A lot of the process for gradient flats also applies here. And actually, a little thing I used to do back then when I didn't want to leave it as pure cell shade was to make my hard shadows, and then I would go in with a softer or lower opacity brush and then outline the shadows so they were like still hard, but like softer. The characteristic feature in this specific style is the lasso tool. For years, I've used it in my illustrations, and it's my favorite tool in Photoshop for now. I use it by selecting the areas where I'd normally apply shading with the solid brush, and then gradient within them with the spaced around one. This leaves us with hard edges like cell shading, but with a smoother look. And then I go in with an eraser, usually of the same kind, and clean up my shapes. And the key takeaway is that it is a gradient, so you have to be mindful in what direction you're fading and how intense you want the fading to be so that you can give an accurate sense of volume. And something that takes a bit getting used to is knowing what areas look good selected together. So the hair is a good example of an area where you could do multiple selections and do a giant wash, because not only will you have gradients within the individual selections, but with the whole area as well, and it won't really look that tacky. Something to keep in mind that can net you some pretty cool results, so select wisely. I mentioned earlier how I use an eraser to clean up my shapes, and this is something I started doing in like the last year or two. So I've taken to habit to prefer laying down like blots of color and then erasing it into the shape that I want rather than the other way around. And it just feels more flexible, and everything looks so flowy depending on what eraser you use. So give it a go. The last thing about this style is the line art, and this will vary depending on whatever mood I'm in, but I have a fear of overpowering my lines with shadows, and like I said, I love doing lines, so I want to make sure that my colors are complementing it rather than erasing them. So sometimes I will add a more solid blacks to avoid that, or I'll go into the other route and just lean into it and add some nice gradients to the line art so it could blend into the piece. So it depends what vibe you want, whatever mood you're in. This piece was another one I didn't really complete well, since I was just so focused on getting this filmed that I lost track of how I actually do things. But once the base is done, and I didn't mention this in the gradient flats because I do this there as well, but I'll merge everything and then I'll add my final touches on one layer. And one of my favorite things to do, both here and there, is to set my brush to color burn and then kind of go over the shaded areas of my piece, because it really just adds this nice deepening to my shadows. I also really like using the overlay setting on the brush and maybe even the color dodge to add a nice oomph to my rim lighting. So here is an updated version of this piece post-filming. Last but not least, painted. There's not much to say about this one since it's a mesh of the other two and then elevated a bit to emphasize the volume in a more detailed way. This style will vary based on what mood I'm in as with the other ones, but I typically like it when the brush strokes are more visible over a super hyper smooth surface. It'll also vary on whether or not I have line art. I typically only use this style if I don't have it, since part of the appeal of painting for me is the flowy freeness of it, and the existence of line art kind of stresses me out. It subconsciously stops me from exploring since the line art acts as a visual box. Usually I prefer jumping to the style with a refined sketch layer of sorts, and then I can set it to multiply, add the flats and basic shadows under, and then paint on a merged version of that. One of the most fun things for me to play with in this style is ambient lighting and adding bright saturated colors in areas of shadow. Painting is really just a place I feel very free to experiment and be loose, because line art is just the perfectionist side of me talking. When I'm working with lines, I also tend to autopilot a lot, so painting offers me a way to break from my usual process. This will obviously differ for you depending on what your usual tendencies are, but if you're anything like me and you live and die by the lines, then I highly recommend letting go of inks and layers and just freeballing it. Again, I've gone ahead and refined this drawing a bit post-film to give it a closer look to what my usual finished result is. So there you have it, my favorite rendering styles. There's always so much I wish I did differently as I'm editing these when I realized how much I missed, how much better the art could have been, and whether what I'm saying is even helpful at all, so hopefully you enjoyed it. As far as the tablet goes, I've only used it for a week, but I absolutely love it. The resolution is much higher than I'm used to, but it looks super crisp. Pen pressure is off the charts, and it feels so nice when it's moving on the screen. They say no protection is needed, but honestly, I'm kind of paranoid I'll scratch it in some way over time because Wacoms are awful about that. Shortcut buttons are super handy, no pun intended, and the colors are actually super vibrant, so it's beautiful to look at and use. This is the first time I've decided to permanently use something that's not a Wacom, which is pretty big for me, so I'll keep you updated on the long-term wear and tear of the HUION. A huge shout out to the sponsors of this video, those of you on Patreon. Thank you so much. Your patronage has allowed me to continue making art content on the daily. And if you haven't already checked it out, I do sketch requests, art critiques, share process videos, and sketchbook pages, as well as PSD files and so much more. And if you're a subscriber here, thank you for watching, commenting, liking, sharing my videos. Your support is also a huge help. And if you're not subscribed, what are you doing? Get to it, chop, chop. We're almost at 100K. Seriously, thank you all again, and I'll see you guys next video. Bye.